Today, we will be presenting on the paper called "A Continuous Semantic Space Describes the Representation of Thousands of Object and Action Categories Across the Human Brain." Alright, we're just going to start off with a little bit of background before we delve into our paper. So previous studies have suggested that specific cortical areas are involved in specific object recognition. For example, the fusiform face area is involved in recognizing faces. The problem with this theory is the fact that humans can recognize thousands of different objects and actions, but we have a limited brain space. Other studies have shown that naturalistic movies produce a widespread rather than a localized bold response, and this indicates that cortical representation of objects may be more distributed than originally thought. Semantics have to do with the meaning of words and logic. So a semantic space is when similar objects, such as a cat and a dog, are represented more closely together in space than objects that are more different, such as a bird and a bridge. The question that the researchers wanted to answer with this study was, does a continuous semantic space underlie visual category representation in the human brain? And they hypothesized that yes, object and action categories are represented in a continuous, smoothly mapped semantic space across the cortex. The methods of the study involve measuring the bold response of 5 male human subjects aged 25 to 32. A 3 Tesla MRI scanner was used to measure the bold response while they watched 120 minutes of movie trailers without sound. The researchers used a lexical database called WordNet to create a word map with cognitively similar meanings. For example, person would be connected to both organism and athlete. WordNet is a database that essentially sorts all the words in the English language into categories of synonyms. Within the 120 minutes of movie trailers, the researchers manually tagged each second of the trailers with all salient stimuli present in the scene. So for example, this is a screenshot of the Marley and Me trailer, and here the researchers would encode things like human, child, dog, and talking for this frame. And again, the purpose of this was to see if there was semantic representation of objects and actions in the cortex. This is a figure from the paper showing the experimental design. So subjects viewed 2 hours of natural movies or movie trailers while the bold response was measured. So the researchers went through and coded what objects and actions were present in each scene. And you can see examples of the categories they used, like women, talking, and text. So they coded what was appearing at each time point and assigned beta weights or category model weights to each category in each voxel based on how they responded to the movie. And then they tested their predictions by showing another movie and comparing the bold responses in every voxel to the previously predicted response that they had found during the first movie. This figure shows the results from 2 individual voxels. So the red represents a positive predictive response, whereas the blue indicates a negative predictive response. The left image shows responses in one voxel in the parahippocampal place area, and this voxel showed category selectivity for scenes involving structures, buildings, roads, devices, and vehicles. And if you can't read the words, that is basically the area with the large red circles indicating a positively predicted response. The right image shows responses in one voxel in the right hemisphere precuneus, and this voxel showed positive responses to people, carnivores, communication verbs, rooms, devices, and vehicles. So it appears to be selective for when people or animals interact socially.
The researchers used a voxel-wise analysis to examine the cortical representation of the 1,700 object and action categories. Principal component analysis revealed 4 different dimensions that explained most of the variance in voxel activation and appeared to distinguish between different characteristics and stimuli. The figure shows the 4 principal components and the percent variance explained by each of the dimensions on the y-axis. For example, 2 of the 4 dimensions found to be shared across the group of subjects distinguish between mobile categories and non-mobile categories, such as people versus buildings, and animals with non-animals. The following figures represent the shared semantic dimensions across subjects. Figure A displays a semantic tree distinguishing between the mobile and non-mobile categories of the first principal component. Each node represents a single noun or verb. The area of each node indicates the magnitude of similarity, shown in red, or dissimilarity, shown in blue, between the predicted and actual bold responses, depending on the dimension of interest. Links between nodes indicate is-a relationships. For example, an arm is a body part. A person is an athlete. Figure B is a three-dimensional map that helps us visualize the similarity of categories, and similar colors mean categories are represented similarly in the brain. Figure C combines the nodes and links of Figure A with the color scheme in Figure B to visually represent the semantic similarity across 3 of the 4 dimensions found. For example, a mammal is high on both the second and third dimensions and thus appears yellow. The color wheel on the right helps visualize how different categories are color-coded based on their semantic selectivity. The results of the investigation support the author's hypothesis that different individuals' brains represent object and action categories across a common semantic space. This figure shows a cortical flat map for one individual where a color was assigned to each voxel based on the scheme described in Figure 4, where areas with similar semantic selectivity have similar colors. The figure displays how the semantic space is represented through gradients across the cortex and particularly across visual areas. Furthermore, the pattern of semantic cortical organization was found to be shared among individuals. These patterns were also consistent with well-studied and selective brain areas, such as the fusiform face area and parahippocampal place area.
This study is exciting because it was the first study to show that the brain represents visual categories in a continuous semantic space. The researchers hypothesized that the brain may have evolved this continuous semantic space because it is likely more efficient, in terms of neural circuitry and neural firing, for the brain to encode visual objects that are more similar more closely together than objects that are more different. This paper is also important because it disproves the common idea that there is a distinct brain region for every category of object. While this was a novel and an exciting study, there were some limitations associated with it. First of all, there were only 5 male participants included in this study, and all of them were members of the lab that conducted the study. This is a limitation because the group's findings may not be generalizable to the entire population, as their participants are not representative of the population as a whole. Second, the researchers identified in the paper that there is a world net bias. This occurs because some categories appear much less frequently than others in the movies, and therefore did not get an entire category assigned to them. Finally, while this study only discussed 4 dimensions in detail, there are likely many more than 4. The study was limited in the sensitivity of the fMRI machine as well as the number of categories shown in the videos. Moving forward from this study, it is important to try and increase the sensitivity of the technology and increase category representation in the videos in order to try and identify more dimensions and reduce the word net bias. It will also be important to attempt to discriminate between visual and conceptual representations, meaning that when someone was watching this video and they saw a rat, for example, they may have also thought of cheese, mice, and tails. So future studies should work towards discriminating the actual visual stimuli from the conceptual stimuli. Finally, we thought that the future studies should look at other senses and try and determine if they are also represented in similar semantic spaces. And, interestingly enough, the authors apparently also thought this, and they just published a paper for speech, and they found that speech is represented in a similar semantic fashion. This concludes our presentation, and thank you for listening.